Hey everyone, welcome to the 2021 Leaders in Trade Compliance series. For anyone who's watching now or afterwards, thank you so much for being here. If you haven't subscribed on YouTube, just go scroll down, click on the subscribe button. And while we're talking, if you have any questions, just type your questions below and we'll get back to you as soon as we can. Today we have Darie Achstein-Conway with us. She's the Trade Compliance Manager, uh, rental, is it Electro rent, right?
Electro, yep.
I always get confused for some reason. I say rental electric. I don't know why I do that in my head. I always switch the words around.
That's
So
okay.
sorry about that. We have
Okay.
you, Darie, with us, and you also work as an instructor with Global Training as well. So thank you so much for being here.
My pleasure.
I really appreciate you being here, and kind of giving a background to the audience, whether they're watching now or whether they watch afterwards. It's a pleasure to have you here. So thank you so much. So let's begin by talking about you. The first thing I noticed, at least on LinkedIn, was that you did your bachelor's in communication and marketing, right? So how did you end up coming into trade compliance from communications? What happened there?
Well, I started out as an art history major, actually, and then found out that there wasn't a whole lot that was going to be offered to me with that particular study. And I remember telling my dad, probably my sophomore year, that I was changing majors, and he said, "Well, what are you going to change majors to? Go find something that you do well." And so I started looking around, and I found out communications. So I went back to him and said, "Yeah, I'm going to study communications." He goes, "Great. So you're gonna go to college to learn how to communicate better when all you do is talk anyway." I'm like, "Works for me, and there's a degree in it, so why not?" No, but I think with most trading compliance people, and I mean this is true in the majority that I've spoken to over the years, people have fallen into it by accident. It's not one of those things that you think about in eighth grade. Like when I grow up, I think I'll go into trading compliance. No, I mean I didn't even know it existed until I
Mhm,
started working on in the military sector
mhm.
in like seriously last century. So we don't have to necessarily talk about the year, do we? It was a long time ago.
Not unless you want to.
No, it was probably I probably started working in the arena of this type of work probably around
We-
94, 95.
mhm,
Hi, Elsa. um, and the military is the one sector of industry that demands that you have somebody in global trade and compliance.
mhm,
I had never even heard of that before. And it was funny because the gal that was doing it before I got there, I actually was hired as an assistant buyer. And she had been with the company for many years and she left. And so it was like, oh, let's give it to the new girl. She has no idea what she's doing. So we can just throw all this stuff at her. So that's kind of how I fell into it, frankly.
mhm,
But no, it's been great. And so then probably the late 90s, early 2000s, when semiconductor started or aerospace, excuse me, started to, take a turn for the worst, if you would. Um,
mhm,
I went into the commercial side of semiconductor and telecom, and that's where I spent the most of my career is within. It's always been technology based, but I spent most of it in manufacturing, um, telecom, semiconductor, and when I went into that world, they didn't they didn't have what you would call a traditional import export person, right?
mhm,
So I got into like the logistics side of things and learned supply chain and became a buyer, and so it's been very much full circle. And then a gentleman who was a mentor for many years, sadly after 9/11, he called me back up and said, "Hey, do you know anything about like customs imports?" And I'm like, "Yeah, I started in that world. Yeah, I know about it." And sadly, because of we know what happened 9/11, um,
mhm,
goods just got stopped and security heightened and so forth. So this particular gentleman, who's always been a mentor, he he asked me if I could take a look at a couple of things for the company that he was working for. And I said, sure, let me see if I can translate it. And the company itself was probably taking about 3 weeks to clear goods.
Mm-hmm.
And not and I say this not in vain, but I took a look at what they were asking for and got it cleared in like 3 days. But it's just the folks that worked for this gentleman didn't understand the technical terms, I guess would be the
Mm-hmm.
best way to put it, with customs. And customs wasn't really advocating specifically what it was that they needed. So it was kind of like they kind of just needed a bridge or a catalyst, if you would, to translate that. And yeah, so thankfully he said, "Hey, why don't you come work for me, and pay to put you back in the school, and learn some new stuff." And so I came back into it. I had been out for probably about 4 or 5 years at that point. And he paid for me to go to a great program at Long Beach State, and kept his word and paid for the whole thing, and fell back into it. And since really about 2004, I've been back full swing. But I jokingly say, though, I've had more first days than most people will in a lifetime, um, because being in technology, there's always a merger, there's always an acquisition, there's
Uh-huh.
somebody
Mm-hmm.
buys this, and then you move over here. I mean, I was with one company, and I think they spun off like 11 times. So,
Yeah.
you know, I always jokingly say, don't look at my resume. You're disappointed. I promise. I can explain every single one of those changes. Uh, but yeah, I mean, now I'm working on a fantastic company called Electro,
Mm-hmm.
and I couldn't be happier being there. I do want to mention, though, that what we discuss here today is just based on my own experience and
Mm-hmm.
not what I'm doing for them today. So
Yeah,
get
yeah,
that out
definitely.
there.
Definitely. Thanks for that. And you did mention a couple of things, and I do want to point out, kind of like focusing on them, Um, how you said when you begin and someone reached out to you, your mentor reached out to you, and then you kind of helped the company out, and then you ended up getting that job. I feel like a big part of trade compliance is networking, whether you're doing it online or whether you're doing it
Mhm.
in person. Trade compliance community itself, they're very, very small. Everyone knows everyone, because there are not that many licensed customs brokers, or just because this whole trade compliance world is very small. So being available and being kind of networking with everyone and connecting with everyone, it's a main thing to do if you want to grow, if you want to get somewhere. I feel like that's essential. That's especially true for this particular career, not just others. So if you're in this career, if you want to enter into this field, even if whether you have the background or not, if you're available, if you can help someone out, if someone reaches out to you, just stay connected to other people, stay connected to trade compliance leaders, to other professionals, to specialists. Maybe someone needs a classification, maybe someone needs some help on one thing. If you can help someone out, it's going to go a long way for you in the future as well. And like you said, I mean, you kind of began in communication and marketing, and then you ended up with being a buyer in supply chain, then from there on logistics, and then trade compliance, and then end up working for someone who paid for your school. And that's amazing. That kind of shows the whole trend of what someone might uh, need or might. I do have a lot of people on my YouTube channel. I think right now I have 515 subscribers, and all of them are in trade compliance, because my channel, YouTube channel, it's about trade compliance.
Yeah, it's interesting because going back to what you said earlier. So yeah, I've worked obviously trade. I've done a lot of logistics. I've done both sides for global licensing is actually my forte with an. But I've been a buyer. I was a planner. I've worked directly for supply chain. I've also worked directly for legal. It's funny because when I look back and I think and I tell people, oh yeah, I was an auditor for a couple of years, and oh yeah, I was a planner, and oh yeah, I've done purchasing. You start to hear it in your head like, oh gosh,
Hmm.
that makes me a really it doesn't make me sound very good. But in all retrospect, all these years later, it has come full circle from the standpoint
Hmm.
that, when I'm talking to somebody in purchasing, I can relate to what they're saying because I've been
Hmm.
there. Or
Yeah.
if a planner says, we know that you've got an order, say in Hong Kong, and you want to source it from that depot or that hub that's based in Malaysia, but we can't because we don't have the inventory to fulfill it, right? So we've got to send it from wherever, pick a country,
Hmm.
Germany, and fulfill it from there. So it has helped because I understand what it is that the internal teams are trying to advocate. Sometimes you just can't perform. you know, the supply chain is what it is, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's a puzzle,
Mm-hmm.
and you want to make sure you don't have all your eggs in one basket, and you're constantly, the wheels are constantly moving, and where things are at, who to go to. So I'm very appreciative, especially
Mm-hmm.
now, all
Mm-hmm.
these years later, because you really realize, the importance of reaching out to people in every part of the company. And
Mm-hmm.
that's what I love most about this position
Mm-hmm.
is you don't just work with the 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 engineering team. You don't just work with the shipping folks. You work with engineering. You work with finance because you may have duties and applicable taxes apply. You work with your salespeople, obviously, because
Mm-hmm.
they got to get that holy revenue out the door, and they got to tap into somebody, and
Mm-hmm.
you always end up becoming somebody's favorite person.
Mm-hmm.
The last day of the quarter, or they're like, hey, I haven't heard from somebody in a long time, and they're like, hey, how are you? I miss you. I'm
Mm-hmm.
like, what do you mean you miss me? Oh wait, you got a part that needs an export license, or you need
Uh-huh.
some help moving something. Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
I got it.
Yeah, definitely.
But no, it's earlier you said though, you know, teaching, right? And how do you learn? Like, this is such an interesting, still all these years later, it's such an interesting industry to me because there's not really somewhere that you can go
Mm-hmm.
and have like a degree in global
Mm-hmm.
trade. You can
Yep.
do it in global business, you can do it in logistics. I've seen it, but I've never seen anything that emphasizes on global trade. So,
Mm-hmm.
I mean, our networking is everything.
Yep.
I mean, things like LinkedIn are amazing. Great organizations to be involved with, doing things like this. So, thank you again for asking, because this is how we get the word out, and this is how we support our own community.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I'm always happy to talk to somebody who is even thinking about doing this, right?
Mm-hmm.
And wants some perspective, regardless of the industry that you're working in, whether it's, textile, or, the wine and spirits,
Mm-hmm.
industry or whatever. But the thing is, the foundation's the same, right?
Yep.
If you're in global trade, and I know, like yourself, you said you work in automotive, that's fascinating to me because that's just not a world that I've worked in.
Mm-hmm.
But I can only imagine that, if we were to step in that role, like
Mm-hmm.
know and have enough of a foundation to come in, know what would be needed from the import standpoint, and then you could teach me the business side of it. So that's
Mm-hmm.
the beauty of what we do, is that we can certainly take these lessons that we learn from all the different companies and experiences that we have, and always apply them. And I
Mm-hmm.
always tell people, if you have a company that is willing to pay for any kind of education, I mean, any class that you can take, tap into somebody, do it.
Mm-hmm.
Because if something happens, and I can tell you, you go through a merger and acquisition and your job changes, nobody can take that education away from you.
Mm-hmm.
If you
Right.
have companies that are willing to pay for that, or send you to some sort of trade, um, expertise,
Mm-hmm.
anything,
Mm-hmm.
joint affiliations, there's some great ones out there that are very inexpensive. So we have to tap into our communities, and we have to continue networking
Mm-hmm.
just to
Yeah.
keep on top of what's going on. Because I've often said it, I'll go to a BIS update, say on export controls and encryption, and I walk in thinking, oh, I know this stuff. I got it. I've been doing this for so long, I could probably give the lecture. Then I
Mm-hmm.
walk out of there like, deer in the headlights, like, oh
I didn't
god,
know anything.
I I failed. I got to go back. Like, but
Right.
I think you have to be really humbled in the fact that you have to continue wanting to learn,
Mm-hmm.
and not only wanting to learn, but also wanting to help the next generation, if you could, or if
Mm-hmm.
you call that, or the next lineage that's coming up, or even interested in going down this road.
Mm-hmm. No, definitely, I agree with you. And like you mentioned, trade compliance is just so vast and so diverse that you can never know everything in it,
Oh
And if you
yeah,
can learn something, even if you don't use it today, or if you feel like you're never going to use it, if there's an opportunity to learn something, go and learn it. Even if you can retain just one or two things from an hour's lecture, 2 hours lecture, then that's good because
Mm-hmm.
it's gonna be useful to you in the future. Is trade compliance? It's just one, anything can happen at any time, especially nowadays. Especially within the last 4 or 5 years. I mean, anything can change at any time. They can throw out any rules and regulations. They can change any rules and regulations at any time. And on top of that, it's just simply so diverse that you need to understand you have to keep up with everything. So you have to be the kind of person who wants to learn, who's passionate about the subject, who's willing to improve yourself with the company you're working for, or just be into it to keep on going because it's something that's going to keep on changing every single day. And like you said, you've had many days with your first days, and that doesn't just apply to when there are mergers, it also applies to when something random comes. You've been at the job for 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, and then you see something within that same job which you've never seen before. You're like, what's going on? I've never dealt with
Hey,
this
how did I
before.
miss that?
Yeah, exactly. How do I not know this? It's a
Yeah.
very common thing. And in regards to that, it's funny. Yeah, I think it was today or yesterday. I had someone on YouTube who kind of made a comment in one of my videos, and they asked you, what can you do with by being a customs broker or having a customs broker license? What can you do? And I'd like your opinion on it too. But from my side, what I would say, you can do so much that it's really as general as you want to, or you can be as narrow as you want to, depending on what you want to do. You can work as a consultant, you can work as a custom broker, you can work on the importer side as an exporting agent, or it's just there's so much you can do. You just have to choose a pathway, keep that goal in mind, and just keep at it. And that's how you'll grow. That's how you'll learn, and that's how you'll advance.
Oh yeah, no, absolutely. And the thing is I like what you said that there's so many avenues, right? Um, and when somebody asks me to, I always jokingly say like, I'll be at a dinner party or something, and somebody says, "Oh, what do you do?" And I'm like, "Oh, I do,
Nothing, nothing.
yeah, I don't do much. I do global trade." And it's like, "Oh, what's that? Like stocks?" I'm like, "Oh no, 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 no. Let me start to explain." And then I start to explain, and you can almost see like the drool coming out of the side of their mouth, like, "Oh God, that just sounds awful." But I'm
Hmm.
like, "No, it's cool stuff. Like,
Hmm.
give me 5 minutes of your time, and I'll explain it to you." But when you really try and break it down, I mean, the whole umbrella of global trade, there's so many avenues that you can go through, and that's what I really like. If you want to stay on the brokerage side, you can certainly do that. I mean, something like, again, going back to the education piece, if you have a broker's license, right? I mean, you could, stay with a large broker. You could work for a boutique broker. You could even go, inside of a company and be phenomenal there, even though maybe you're not acting as a an officer, if you would,
Hmm.
of of um, of imports, but you have such a good understanding of how to look up, HTS codes, and how to explain to maybe an engineering staff, this is where we need to go to do this product. I mean, again, any education you can get, take it.
Hmm.
One thing I kind of kick myself now. I did the broker's classes, but I never took the test because I just wasn't in a position necessarily where I needed it. And it was great to have. I'm glad I took the classes. But I look back now, and I don't like the word regret, but I should have just taken that next jump and just
Hmm.
taken the test, even though I probably wasn't going to, become a customs broker or so forth. But it's just that added piece of,
Hmm.
information, or just that extra piece of paper. Maybe you say, I did this, and I've got this education, and
Hmm.
I've, I did my broker's license. And so that might just bounce you up to the next tier. So,
Hmm.
if somebody gives you the opportunity, take it.
Hmm. So,
Always, always.
so you've never taken the exam yourself, ever?
I never took the exam, and
Oh, wow.
now I really kick myself. I doubt I would pass now.
I
I
think,
I
I
would I
think you
would
can.
start.
I think you can.
I don't know. We'll see. No, but I would definitely start over. But I'm certainly glad I took the classes. Now
Hmm.
I paid for those on my own because it was something that I wanted to do, and no regrets by any means. Like I said, I don't like that word anyway, but I should have gone the extra mile and taken it. But where I have worked, I think at the time when I took the classes, my thought process is what or was, we're not in a position to do, self brokerage, if you would. And there was so much moving around the world and such a large global footprint that it just wouldn't have been feasible for us to do it in house.
Mm-hmm. No,
But I did the education, so for that I'm grateful.
yeah, no, I get it. I mean, I took my exam in October 2019, the first time, and I did end up passing the exam. And I took it because just for that paper, like you said, I mean,
Hmm.
I never planned to work as a custom broker or, open my own custom brokerage. I don't have that plan. I never had that plan, but I took the exam anyway because one, it does teach you a lot about the stuff you don't see every single day. And second, it's just that piece of paper that kind of has value, even though
Absolutely.
it's not required. It doesn't, the paper itself doesn't teach you anything.
Hmm.
Uh, Taking the exam, you kind of know where to find the information, but it doesn't really make you any smarter, honestly. It's just a piece of paper which is kind of valued in the industry. And that's why it's good to have it. But at the end, though, like I wanna talk about you. Like you never took the exam, and you're still here, and you're pretty successful. So people who don't or cannot pass the exam, they shouldn't think that it's something that's necessary to become successful.
Oh,
That's a
yeah,
point I
no.
want to point out to them because um, sometimes that's the idea that holds people back, or that's the idea why, or the reason why they try. But at the same time, they need to know that even though it's something that does have a unique place, it's not something you need to be successful. Whether you're within the same company, whether you plan to move out and do something else, or whether you plan to change industries, it's not something that's required. And on every job posting, I mean, it's probably gonna say um, preferred. It's preferred that you have a custom broker license, but I'm sure you could get the same job even without one. You just need to develop the experience or know the people, network around, and kind of become useful in a matter which is essential to the company.
I I appreciating and bouncing off of that point. Again, in all the years I've been doing this, the last probably 5 years, the dynamics in this industry, and I'm not talking about a particular industry. I'm talking about trade.
Hmm.
Heightened duties on goods made in China. I mean, I never expected that we would see something like, add an extra 25% because of section, 302 and this and that. And and I think one thing we have to remember in this industry is, and especially after 2020 going into 21 and with this pandemic, I mean, business from a business across the board, no matter again what industry you're in, has gone through some serious, ups and downs and ebbs and flows. And if we haven't learned anything at all, it's how to be much more flexible,
Hmm.
right? Because we didn't have a choice. We weren't doing this one on one anymore, like in the office, standing around a water cooler and, talking about
Hmm.
the latest TV show we saw. And we also had to learn how to be not only flexible, but very, I don't know what the right word would be. I guess humbled,
Hmm.
right? That we're still working because, it's been a tough year. I
Yep.
have a lot of friends that have are still looking for jobs, and they've been out of work for a long time.
Hmm.
So again, any sort of education, stepping into your networks, um, never burn your bridge.
Yep.
If there's one thing I've learned, don't do that, because to your point, you said it early on, and very elegantly. This is a small industry, and
Hmm.
the only thing that you have to savor is your reputation,
Hmm.
and who's out there, and keeping in contact with people. Never, that old adage, like, don't burn a bridge. And again, somebody who's been has who's had to change jobs not by choice most of the time,
Hmm.
but because of
Hmm.
mergers and acquisitions. you know you can still be classy and still, um, be humbled, right?
Hmm.
With the people that you've worked with, even if the next chapter you're moving on. But
Yep.
but but the point is, always appreciate those people who helped you get to where you are today. Just like the gentleman I mentioned early on who paid for my schooling. I mean, there's no way I could ever repay him. I've probably said thank you 1,000 times to him. He's like, and he kind of rolls his eyes like, okay, get over it already. I'm like, no, but it was a big deal. It helped me
Mm-hmm.
get to where I'm at, and I appreciate that. So you kind of hope that along the way, it sounds such a cliche, but pay it forward.
Mm-hmm.
That's why I was so thrilled when you asked me if I wanted to do this, because again, there's people out there. I mean, even though I've been around, my teenager says since so last century, um, there's so many people that are coming into this industry that
Mm-hmm.
I unfortunately have not yet to meet, and because of this pandemic, the last what are we going on month 14 or
Yeah.
13?
Yeah.
There hasn't been that being able to get out there and do the one-on-ones. I mean, I believe in going to all the seminars that you can, and if you can't make them, do the stuff online. But I think the best thing we get out of the interaction when you go to some sort of seminar or trade show for a couple of days,
Mm-hmm.
you can't put a dollar value on the people that you connect with. I think
Mm-hmm.
that's probably outside of the stuff about and you learn. You can't put a price on people that you
Mm-hmm.
can reach out to. I mean, there's people I met at trade shows 15 years ago that I
Mm-hmm.
still talk to 2 or 3 times a month, and those are people I tap into today. And it's funny because when you've been around for a little while, you see people move around, but that's so great because what they learned at one company they may not be doing at the next, but they can still help answer a question
Mm-hmm.
because of their past experience. So it's so important to keep, you know, touch base with people, stay in contact with people. The networking is probably the number one thing I would recommend to anybody, because
Yeah, definitely.
some you may not always know. Here, I love this because I'll have somebody internally, they'll call you and say, hey, so do you think we can ship to Thailand? And I'm like, okay, well, I'm not in Thailand. But if you have a question, I probably have somebody in my network that I could tap into that could at least point me in the right direction.
Mm-hmm.
And that's just because of keeping in touch with people and putting yourself out there on LinkedIn. Social media, I know some people would like, ugh, social media, it's terrible, but it can be used for some really good, vital communication. And again, this last year, I mean, who hasn't been on at least, 3 Zoom happy hours or, dinner with the family? Like, last Easter was the first time I didn't get to spend with my parents and, my whole life. And we were doing a Zoom dinner. Like, if you told me I'd be
Mm-hmm.
doing that 2 years earlier, I'd laugh at you. Like, my mom didn't
Yeah.
even know how to turn on Zoom.
Yeah, I
I
think
had to call her and walk her through it.
we made a lot of progress in technology as well.
Yeah, and so I think it's interesting. I mean, and this whole pandemic goes back to certainly, our industry, because
Mm-hmm.
we have to be flexible. We have to be willing to, you know, the flexibility and just being able to go with it. And I jokingly say after so many years, you end up becoming very thick-skinned and a little bit narcissistic in this world, because you just can't react and jump at when every time somebody calls and says we have a problem. Like,
Mm-hmm.
okay, well, so we got a problem, but let's talk it out. Like, walk me
Yeah.
through the scenario. Let's go all the way back to the first conversation you had about this order. Where did
Mm-hmm.
it go sour? You know, and I have found just by just talking to people what seemed like a major problem, I understand from their perspective why it came across that way.
Mm-hmm.
But when you break it down, it's not as bad as it looks.
Mm-hmm.
You
Yeah,
know,
exactly.
yeah.
I feel like the reason for that is because we know the technical terms, and when the
Hmm.
people who are not in this industry, like whether they're purchasing, whether they're legal, whether they're HR, when they see these terms and they just come across it, or someone tells them that there's an issue with it, they just kind of freak out. That kind of it goes back to what you said earlier at the beginning. You know how you said your background in supply chain, being a buyer, it helps you kind of understand their point of view and their side of things. I feel like it's very, very essential to kind of communicate with everyone within your department. Whether it's purchasing, legal, HR, not just the networking with people who are in trade compliance on LinkedIn. It's also good to network with people who are also not within trade compliance, because when you're working in trade compliance, you interact with the entire company, and you sometimes, a lot of time, you do it proactively, and you get involved in stuff where, even though you might not be involved in the whole initiation to the end of that subject, you're still a very essential part of the whole process. And because of that, you need to interact and understand and have someone within these different category of, like, whether it's purchasing, whether it's some of the supply chain portion, whether it's transportation. You need to be able to connect with other people as well who can kind of work with you to figure everything out. And it's kind of like the same thing you do when you're networking with people in your own industry, whether it's online, whether it's seminars. You have to be able to interact with everyone who is around you and work proactively to make sure um, everyone knows what's happening around you and how it's going to affect overall, whether it's customs, whether it's supply chain, what's actually going to happen.
I love that. So I think, to add to that point, like the time that I've done some instruction for the Global Training Center, it's been probably the best part of this career that I have been very fortunate to be in. There are days, don't get me wrong, when I'm like, why do I do this? but then, it all circles back around. I'm like, yeah, no, I enjoy this. But what I have found that's been a lot of fun instructing in those classes is the variety of people that you get from every industry. And you get somebody who's such a novice that they're like, what's a CCATS? Is that like somebody's cat? And they call them CC, what's an ECCN? Like what? One of my favorite mentors in the world, he always said one thing about this business is that it's got more acronyms than you'll ever find in any other industry. And the coolest thing to do is just like throw up your arms and just throw a bunch of acronyms out and just sound like you know what you're talking about. And people think it's cool. That's some of the best experience or some of the best advice I ever got. But I really loved the in-person teaching, and I have missed that immensely over this last 12, 14 months. Look forward to getting back to that. But what's so cool is that people that were in those classes with me, I talk to on a daily basis. Sometimes, they reach out and I haven't seen them or talked to them in a couple of years, but maybe they're looking for a job and they tap back in and say, hey, I'm here. I know that you have a pretty vast network. Got any recommendations? I love that. And I think again, I keep going back to the pandemic, but one of the things that's been probably a shining star out of this whole thing is reconnecting with people that I hadn't seen or talked to 5, 6, one guy, 10 years. He called me out of the blue and he's just like, hey, it's been a few years. I know we worked together. I saw something you posted on LinkedIn. Wanted to reach out and say hi. How's it going? How's the family? I mean, it was really nice. And that was 7, 8 months ago. And now I talk to him probably every 2 or 3, just touch base. What are you seeing in your world? He's actually based in EMEA. And so it's nice also to have that international networking because, just because we're doing one thing here in the States does not mean that that's the way it's happening overseas. I mean, there's this, I don't know if you've heard of it, but it's it has changed. It has changed dramatically over in the UK because of that. So it was great to have those folks, that you've been friends with or acquaintances with or worked with at other companies that you can tap into and say, look, I'm seeing this from my little world in Southern California. Is this the way it's actually coming across, or what kind of information are you hearing? So, when I hear people say, oh gosh, what you do just doesn't sound fun. It just sounds boring. It's like, well, you got to give it a chance, and that's what I'm hoping that we can share with the next generation of these folks coming out. And I really, if anybody's out there listening, I hope we come up with better ways to teach these folks.
Mm-hmm.
I hope that
Definitely.
there's education out there that they can tap into.
Mm-hmm.
Universities tapping into like GTC, where I've done some stuff with, because it's unfortunate. There's some great resources out there, but when you're trying to introduce it to somebody who's a novice, it's kind of hard to direct them and say, go start here and you'll work your way all the way over to here. You know,
Mm-hmm.
it's kind of like you kind of get thrown to the wolves and you just got to go figure it out. And then
Mm-hmm.
go. I
Yeah,
mean,
definitely.
in one of the classes, this was, gosh, probably 3 or 4 years ago, I had a gal in there, and I always make it a point to go around the room and say, okay, so, what's your name? What is the position in the company that you do? And how did you get here? And my favorite response is always like, I didn't choose this. Somebody told me I had to do this, right? And so I had this gal that was in one of the classes. It was an export documentation class, actually. And I said, so your name? She goes, her name. And I said, what's your company and your background? She said, well, I was a stay-home mom for a number of years. And I started working for a small company, answering the phones because my kids were grown. I wanted to get back into it. And I'm thinking, oh, this is interesting. I wonder where this is going. And she said, and within about 3 weeks after I started at this company, they got audited by
Mm-hmm.
customs. And I guess the gentleman who ran the business, I don't even remember the name of the company. It's a pretty small outfit, I think. He said, yeah, so we got this audit coming out. And he said, apparently he came out to her and like dropped this audit on her table and said, okay, so I need you to go through this and answer whatever customs needs. And she's like, what are you talking about? Why is it me? Like, I answer the phones. And he said, and I'll never forget her response. It was classic. She goes, why me? And the guy said, well, because you signed the FedEx forms. So since you signed the FedEx forms, you know all this stuff, right? Like, what are you talking about? Like, packages get delivered. I signed them and there you go. So it was really fun having her in the class because by the time she got to the class that I was teaching, she had to figure out how to respond to this audit. She eventually ended up moving jobs, which was cool. And she became an export officer. And I kept in touch with
Mm-hmm.
her probably for a good 2 or 3 years. And since COVID, we kind of lost touch. I should reach out to her again. But it was cool listening to that because she was just like, she's like, I never even heard of this field. And
Mm-hmm.
now I'm supposed to be doing this customs audit because I'm the person in the company who signs the FedEx forms and the the DHL forms when they come in. Thanks. Like, you're just dropping off packages to me and now you want me to run this whole thing? How does that
Mm-hmm.
make sense? So
Yeah.
I guess the point is that my favorite stories are how people fell into it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and like you said, I agree with you. A lot of people I speak to, whether it's on this show or away from it, a lot of people say that same thing that you said. They just kind of fall into it. They have no idea that it exists, and they just
Mhm.
come across it, and then they like it, and they stay in it. It was the same thing with me too. No, I got my MBA, and then afterwards I was applying to job and internships. I happened to land internship with the trade compliance company, and then. I loved it. I loved what I saw, and that's why I just continued being in it. But before that, I had no idea that this field even existed. And five
Mhm.
years later, 4.5 years later, right here, I'm right here, and I'm a trade compliance manager. I didn't know I was gonna be here 4 or 5 years ago, but here I am. It's the same with almost everyone that's within this industry.
Yeah, I love that. And I love the success stories, but to flip the coin a little bit, I've met people who really did try and give it a shot and just thought, I just don't want to be this flexible.
Mm-hmm.
One guy I met was like, I get it. Like, you have to stay on top of it. You got to learn the latest and greatest, what's changing in the HS codes, what's changing in encryption world, whatever. And his response was classic. He goes, I'm just too lazy for this. I don't want to think this hard. Bless his
Mm-hmm.
heart. He was, in his later years and probably had about 7 or 8 years before retirement. He was like, I just don't want to learn this. And I
Mm-hmm.
thought that was great because at least he was being honest about it,
Mm-hmm.
and the company that he was with kind of, like the rest of us, kind of threw him to the wolves and said, you got to go figure this out. And he's like, I don't want
Mm.
to. So they found somebody else to do it. But
Yeah.
I wish there was kind of an easy way to explain to folks specifically
Hmm.
what it is that we do. Um, and I love when you talk to somebody who's just always been ITAR compliant, or somebody who just is concentrated on exports, and you say, well, every export has an import, so maybe it's worth flipping the coin a little bit and learning imports. It's not going to
Hmm.
hurt you. It's only going to help you, right?
Yeah. Hmm.
So, yeah, I don't know.
Yeah. Yeah. That's why I initially started my YouTube channel too, because first, I mean, initially in this field, at least in the past, there was difficulty in learning stuff, finding the
Mhm.
stuff. And before, whether even knowing whether you want to take the exam, for example, you'd have to pay just to get that basic information. So what I did initially was I started my YouTube channel. I put some lectures on it, and people loved that. And even in the future, like you said, pay it forward, teach stuff. I have a couple things down the line where I plan, what things that I plan to do, which is gonna help the future generation. So if like you said, for every exportation there's an importation, so it's great to have these resources, whether you're paying for them or whether they're free. And there are a lot of good organizations out there who are great at teaching or putting together seminars or webinars, which are great. But for the people who can't, um, who where they don't work for companies who either pay for them or they can't afford um, paying for stuff, it's also great to have some free resources as well. And like you say, global training. Even though I've never taken a class with global training, I've heard about them. And they're great at teaching what they teach. And someone like you who's teaching, I'm sure you can do an amazing job to kind of give out the basic information, which is gonna help guide that future generation and teach them the stuff they need to do, at least to get everything going on their side.
Absolutely. And I think though it is our responsibility of people that are in this industry, and I say this 100%, that one thing I have learned about changing companies so many times, again, not always by choice, um,
Hmm.
is never draw a line in the sand. And by that I mean, again, the mentor that brought me back into this world, one thing he always taught me was, don't just hold on to what you know. Like,
Hmm.
you want to share that with the general public, meaning, your internal folks. If you have somebody that's struggling and you can help them, put yourself out there. It doesn't hurt. It's kind of like if somebody smiles at you, smile back, just kind of, well, I know that that's a little weird now because we all wear masks, but, maybe a thumbs up or something. But there you go.
Yep.
But, just be willing to be open minded, and
Hmm.
don't shut yourself off, because I think that that's one thing that I've seen over the years is that, when you get complacent, and I don't care if you're in this industry or not, but you get complacent and you're in doing the same thing every day, we have the tendency to only think about what's going on in our little world. But you just can't be that way anymore. You got to be so much more flexible. I mean, somebody who was an assistant buyer when I was an assistant buyer, and I refused to give that year. Um, you didn't need all the education that you need to today, which I think is great. And let's face it, you don't have to hire, somebody that has 17 different degrees. I mean, you got to be flexible and look at experience and everything that goes. As you might have somebody who's been in brokerage who's worked for the same company for 20 years. I mean, can you imagine the amount of knowledge that that person can bring, even though
Hmm.
maybe they didn't necessarily have, the big college degrees and this and that. So again, I think you need to keep a very open mind on the folks that you're dealing with. And I constantly have people ask me, like, what is it you do? And I've just
Hmm.
decided, I tell people I'm now an insurance plan. And they go, an insurance plan? And I'm like, well, look, in California, you can't drive without a license. I mean, I'm sorry,
Hmm.
without insurance if you have
Hmm.
a license, right? So why would you want to ship something globally without having some form of expertise in-house to help your revenue get to where it needs to go. So
Mm-hmm.
there you go. I'm your insurance plan. You know, I'm
That's a
not
good way to put it.
I'm not um, a decision maker. I still have to listen to the business and figure out what it is that they need. And you got to look at how the supply chain works. And again, I always go back to the word flexibility, but how are you going to make our world flexible enough to work within the company, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, I know I get it. We have rules, we have regulations, we have documentation and so forth. But if you've ever been an auditor, you know, one of the things that auditors love is to find gaps, right? And
Mm-hmm.
they want to find that gap and dig into it. Well, instead of and I was an ISO auditor for a number of years. One of the things I learned from that experience was, you know what, I couldn't just go in as an auditor and say, okay, you're doing this wrong, and therefore I'm going to write you up, and this is the way it's going to be. I had to take a
Mm-hmm.
step back and really understand, why is it they're doing what they do,
Mm-hmm.
right? Why is it maybe, Jane is the one filling out the commercial invoices, and you've got Joe over here doing a packing list, and you've got so and so over here doing, and you've got three or four different people doing things, right? It would seem to simplify, automate it all and do this and do that. Well, it turned out that one of the places that I audited, they had no automation. I mean,
Hmm.
they were a small mom and pop company, and everything was spreadsheet and emails. They
Yep.
didn't have that extra cash flow, like some of these big companies that have, you know 25 trade people. I mean, not every company has that luxury, so you really have to take a step back and say, you know where is where are the pressure points? Okay, so we don't have all the top notch automation, but what can we use to make things work? Right, we have SharePoint, we have Access, and if you were to get audited, right, auditors just want to make sure that what you're signing up for and what you say you're doing, you can prove it.
Mm-hmm.
You don't have to have, these multi-million dollar software packages to trace, track, and do everything. I mean, that company that I mentioned where, this person was doing a commercial invoice and this person was doing a packing list, when I started peeling back the layers of the onion, if you would, um, it made sense why they did it that way.
Mm-hmm.
Was it the best way to do it? Probably not. But for the time that they opened, for the short lifespan the company had, it made sense why they were doing what it was that they were doing.
Mm-hmm.
So, again, flexibility and
Yep.
just willing to. And here's what you asked me about my communications degree. Here's where it kicked in. You
Yeah.
just have to be willing to learn how to kind of sit back and listen before you jump. And I think that that's true with any position that you do, but I think it's
Mm-hmm.
really very, very true in what we do.
Yep. Yep. Exactly. And kind of going off of that, when we talk about customs, I feel like a lot of people and a lot of companies need to know that customs, I always stress this point, customs isn't there to get you just because they can, like for example, just like you were working as an auditor and then you had to step back and understand stuff. As long as you work with customs, um, they're willing to work with you too, because they want you to do everything right. Whatever you're saying, whatever you're telling them, they want to know that you understand why you're doing it and you're doing it right. They're not out there just to get you. And like you said, when you worked as an auditor, you had to step back and kind of understand why things were the way they were within the company you're working for. It's the same way on with customs. For example, when we work with the CTPAT specialist, for example, CTPAT officer who's auditing your plan for CTPAT certification, it's kind of the same way. You have to be able to communicate what you do and why you do it. And if you do that effectively and you can show why you do what you do, then they would be willing to work with you and understand and maybe help you out in doing things better in the future as well. So that communication, it really goes away, whether it's working with people who are within your same profession on LinkedIn or seminars, whether it's working with other people in different departments, or whether it's just working with, auditors or someone else with customs. It's communication is the key to communication, and networking is the key to kind of um, make sure what you're doing is correct and what the right way of doing that is.
Again, going back to the classes, the in-house classes I was a part of, hope to be again soon.
Hmm.
um, one of the things that I would always tell people, and I think I said this in the beginning, right? Go around the room, tell me what your position is and where you are in that company, right? So you could have somebody all the way from novice, to somebody who's been doing transportation for 15 years and wants to try trade and so forth. But one of the one of the things I like to advocate to people, and if you get nothing else from this discussion, is that if you've been with your company, say a minimum of a year, couple years on up, you already know imports and exports. And when I tell people that, they kind of go, no, no, and I say, no, no, let me finish, because you know your products.
Hmm.
If I'm in customs, I don't know what part number XYZ means with a description of, you know, sub A, D, C, whatever.
Hmm.
If you already know your product lines, you know the descriptions, you know your parts, you're already halfway there to importing and exporting, because I yes, I might be customs, but I become your student and the person in house becomes the master, meaning that, you know, I need your expertise to explain to me what it is that you're bringing into this country and what it is that's going out, right? I
Hmm.
mean, those folks that, bless the hearts of those people that are doing the inspections and everything, hats off to all of them. I mean, I got a real soft spot for you, because that is some incredible stuff. I've seen it at LAX at the Gateway, and I've seen it at the Customs House in Long Beach and LA. But the paperwork that they get, again, and it's going back to the flexibility, right? If I'm looking at that paperwork, what is on there may not make sense to me. But instead
Hmm.
of the whole world stopping, let's pick up the phone, call, you know, Jane and John and say, hey, we've got this shipment coming in, and what you guys have here doesn't make sense. And if they can come back and say, yes, it does make sense, but here's why. I can give
Hmm.
you the technical documentation. I can explain to it. I can send you pictures. That's why I was always telling people in those classes, I'm like, see, you've just become an exporter, because you
Hmm.
have supplied information
Yep.
that customs didn't have, or an importer. And it was like, I would love the look on people's faces when they would kind of go, oh, that light
Yeah.
bulb would kind of
Hmm.
go off and go, oh, okay. So this is more than just putting something in a box
Hmm.
with a commercial invoice. Absolutely. And I always tell, the folks in logistics, the shipping folks, I'm like, you realize you're the gateway. You're the gateway to those goods exiting out of this building with revenue going out the door. It is fantastic. You can come up with 5 or 6 new generations of a product, but if you can't ship it and it can't get to where it needs to go to that customer, you're
Yep.
not getting your revenue. So,
Yeah.
you have to appreciate from all the way to the top, all the way down, right?
Hmm.
Everybody has a piece of it. It's incredible.
Yep. And I can see and appreciate you teaching stuff to these people. I can already see the teacher inside you,
Well,
and even
link with me, find me. I love having conversations.
and,
I could get on my soapbox and bore you to death. So let me
no,
know.
no, no. It's great, and especially if you can teach. I feel like if you can teach, then then and it's amazing. It's an amazing if you can teach someone something. It goes beyond just knowing the stuff or just like working for other people. The fact that you can give out to someone else and make them understand some things, and the way you're doing it right now, it's really amazing. And I'm sure the people that work with you, they also appreciate everything that you do for them. So thank you
Well,
so
you know what
much.
though? It's the people that make it easy.
Hmm.
I wouldn't call it. I certainly wasn't born to be a teacher. I don't think. I mean, my heart, my hats off to all those teachers out there, especially this last year, right? But what I think is fun about it is it's just being with a group of people that come together, for a day, 2, 3 days, depending on how long the class is, and you bond this commonality because of this industry. Some
Hmm.
again have no idea what an HTS code is and are like, why is C cats? Why can't you call it a C dog? Like, I don't get it, right? All the way to, wow, I've been doing this for 10 years and I'm still sitting in the same company I've been in for 10 years, and yet
Hmm.
nobody understands what I'm talking about. It's so refreshing
Hmm.
to be among people that get it. I would go to these big seminars, and my husband would jokingly say that was kind of like the prom for nerdy trade people. Like, I couldn't wait to go. Like, I would,
Hmm.
when I had to go back to DC for a BIS update, I was already packed and ready to go like a week. I'm like, yay, I want to go with all the nerds, like that, like understand my
Yep.
world.
Yep. And it goes back to what I said. I mean, if you have passion, if you have the willingness to learn new things, it just makes trade compliance much more exciting. And it's amazing what you can learn within it. Even though you can be within this industry for 10, 20 years, then there's still so much out there. Like I said, there's
Oh,
so much out there that you can still learn. And it's just if you're passionate about this, and it's gonna excite you like crazy, and it's amazing. I love being in it. Honestly, I love the fact that I'm involved in everything. I can see everything, and the more I learn, it is just amazing. Even if we only retain one or two stuff from like 1 or 2 hour lecture, that's still great. The fact that you get to see um, so much different stuff. It's amazing
mhm.
within trade compliance.
Yeah, no, it is. I mean, I sound like a total nerd trade person here, but I do love it. I mean, I really do.
Hmm.
There's times, and I jokingly say like, oh, I can't get my package to XYZ, and I need to get this license, and you get so uptight about it. But then you take a step back and you're like, well, these are not things that are my fault. Like,
Hmm.
these are rules
Hmm.
and regulations that we have to follow.
Yeah,
But
exactly.
if we do our diligence, we do our pre-diligence, we just keep the lines of communication open. It's not life or death.
Hmm.
we're
No,
going to get
you
through
have
it.
to you have to understand that
Yeah.
being in trade compliance, you have to understand you always have to take a step back, and whatever the situation is, even if for some reason you have like a super urgent shipment and you just can't get it in, it's not your fault. The regulations are the regulations, and it's your job to make sure everything is done right. Now, it's not your job to just get the stuff through no matter what. Your job is to make sure stuff is coming through legally with proper format, with proper regulations, so that way once it's in, nothing goes wrong afterwards.
Yeah, that's right.
Yep.
That's right.
And,
Well,
and
this has been so much fun. Thank you
mhm.
again for
Yep.
having me.
I was, I was gonna say, I feel like we can talk so much
Oh,
more
I
with you
could,
on
I
here.
could. I'm 4'10", so I could actually like get on my 5 foot soapbox and I could go on all evening. But I know
Yep.
we've only got an hour, so
Yeah.
all I
So
would say is
thank you.
thank you again. If anybody has questions or so forth, reach out to me. I'm on LinkedIn. Always happy to have a good discussion. And
Yeah,
this was really a lot of fun. Thank
Thank you
you.
so much. Thank you so much for being here. I'm sure a
Yeah,
lot
of
of people are
course.
getting offended a lot just getting this background and everything, and I really appreciate you being here. So thank you so much. And like Derry said, if any of you need to reach out to her, feel free. She's great to talk to. She's great to connect to, and she's a great resource of what she does, whether it's trade compliance in general, whether it's teaching some specific information. I mean, she's great at it. Or if you want to
Mhm.
know what she teaches, if you want to attend her class, go ahead and reach out to her and figure out how she can help you. So thank you so much, Terry, again. I
All
appreciate
right.
it.
Thank you,
Okay.
sir. Have a
Yep.
good
Take
one.
care.
Bye,
You too.
everyone.
Bye.